So it's my pleasure to introduce my friend. I'm inspired by her, and we encourage each other to just keep plugging away. WILPF has a few years on us, though, 100 years. Congratulations. Well, I just joined, so you're welcome to not only join the Citizens for Peace, join WILPF, and please join us with a big Citizens for Peace welcome to Laura Dewey.
And thank you very much for inviting me to speak about WILPF. I really appreciate it. And I want to acknowledge another Laura in the room, Laura Perot, a long-standing WILPF member who still has a fire in the So I'm the coordinator of the Detroit branch of WILPF, and I've been a member for about 18 years now. And I joined when my oldest daughter was like 4, I think. I don't know if it was out of boredom or because a dear friend of my mother said, she just called me up one day out of the blue and said, Laura, you should join WILPF. So, and I did. I said, okay, Kate, thanks, no problem. And that's a lesson for a lot of activists. Don't be afraid to ask other people to join your organization. So, WILPF is celebrating its 100th anniversary on April 28th at The Hague in the Netherlands. And we are going to be having 2 meetings there. And I'm fortunate enough to be, I will be traveling there in April to attend, so I'm really grateful for that. So I'm going to give you a brief history of the founding of WILPF, and I want to read a few quotes from people who were there to give you a flavor of the kind of passion that people felt for peace. So the story of WILPF's founding actually has lessons for today, because despite obstacles from governments, despite divisions within the feminist movement, despite a hostile press, unity of purpose can be achieved. So before World War I, the suffrage movement was in full swing, both in Europe and the United States. And WILPF actually was born out of this movement. There are organizations all over the world fighting for women's right to vote, and out of this came a group called International Women's Suffrage Alliance. It was an alliance of organizations. And so when World War I came around, many feminists were concerned about the war. Surprisingly, a lot of feminists were actually pro-war, but a lot of them were anti-war. And so there's a lot of conflict in the feminist movement about this. But early in World War I, 2 anti-war suffragists from warring countries, their names were Emmeline Pethick-Lawrence from Britain and Rosika Schwimmer from Hungary. They went on a speaking tour together in the United States. And it was a compelling sight to see 2 women from 2 countries who opposed each other on the same stage talking against the war. Their goal was to encourage feminists to persuade the U.S. Leaders and the U.S. government to actually lead negotiations to end the war. They felt that the United States, as a neutral nation, had the best chance of agreeing to negotiate. So the anti-war sentiment of many suffragists is reflected in a memoir written by Emmeline Pethick-Lawrence, and I want to quote from a little bit from her here. She said, "In our own and many countries, the idea of the solidarity of women had taken a deep hold upon many of us, so deep that it could not be shaken even by the fact that men of many nations were at war. The principles that had inspired our great struggle for women's emancipation came back to remembrance. Had we not spoken and written of the solidarity of women, whose main vocation in every nation was one and the same," and this is a little outdated, that is, the guardianship and nurture of the human race. Could the women of the world remain silent while men, in the bloom of their youth, were being offered up by many nations for sacrifice? Sacrifice for what? So the tour of these 2 women around the country actually led to the formation of the Women's Peace Party in January 1915 in Washington, D.C. And this organization eventually became the United States section of WILPF. So what led to a big conference in April 28th was there were some feminists who were pro-war, some who were against, and the group called IWSA, International Women's Suffrage Alliance, they actually planned a peace conference in Berlin. But after a lot of pro-war suffragists said, no, we don't want this, they backed down. And they canceled the conference. But the president of the Dutch suffrage movement, her name was Alida Jacobs, would not take no for an answer. And later she wrote about the great need to hold the conference. She said, just because there is this terrible war, the women must come together somewhere, some way, just to show that women of all countries can work together, even in the face of the greatest war in the world. Women must show that when all of Europe seems full of hatred, they can remain united. I felt that the Alliance had to do that, and we should invite the Alliance to meet in Amsterdam. And she's referring to the Alliance of Suffragette Organizations. So she wrote letters to women in several countries, asking them what is their interest in such a conference. And if you can imagine, before the internet, before phones were very prevalent in households, that this sort of activity was done by letter, that gives you pause. So despite all what the response she got was from a lot of women was, well, from a lot of committees around the country, around the world, WSA committees was, no, we're really not interested. But what she got from individual women from around the world were positive response. Yes, we need this conference, we need to find a way to stop this war. So she helped to lead the organization of this conference. So despite the opposition of IWSA, a group of anti-war suffragists met anyway, at The Hague, which is the seat of government in Holland, and the meeting began on April 28, 1915. Now, a lot of governments were not happy about this conference either. 42 delegates sailed by ship from the United States, but the British authorities actually stopped the boat off the coast of Dover and held the boat for 4 days before they released it. So they were able to get to the conference eventually. But of 180 English delegates, only 20 were given passports by the British government. So despite this opposition, over 1,200 or 1,500 delegates, depending on which historian you ask, from 12 different countries actually made it to The Hague, and they attended the 4-day conference. So the meeting was presided over by Jane Addams, whom you know is the social worker who founded Hull House in 1899. She was involved in child labor laws, trade unions, and immigrant rights, and she firmly believed that all these issues were connected together, and that there could be no peace without economic justice. So the women passed, during the course of the meeting, they passed numerous resolutions. And the British delegate, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, later recalled that these resolutions were very similar to the 14 points formulated by Wilson in the speech he gave 3 years later, in 1918, the famous 14-point speech. But they also had an additional resolution calling for, of course, women's suffrage. Pethick Lawrence commented, quote, "The Congress did much more than pass resolutions. It brought into friendly association the women from the belligerent countries and made them realize that their fundamental interests were one and the same." This whole idea of commonality is actually also reflected in the preamble to the resolutions. And the preamble stated, "This International Congress of Women of different nations, classes, creeds, and parties is united in expressing sympathy with the suffering of all, whatever their nationality, who are fighting for their country or laboring under the burden of war. Since the mass of the people in each of these countries now at war believe themselves to be fighting, not as aggressors, but in self-defense, there can be no irreconcilable differences between them, and their common ideas afford a basis upon which an honorable peace might be established." And then it goes on to urge governments of the world to put an end to the bloodshed. So at the time, the notion of people fighting each other, having something in common, must have been pretty radical. So to give you an idea of the mood of the conference, I want to quote Emily Green Bell, who was one of the founders of WILPF. But first, she made a comment about the mass media of their day, which is called the press. And I think you'll recognize some of these comments. Keith Gunther was actually expressing to me just now some frustrations with the media, so you might be able to relate to this. So Emily Greenbelt wrote in her memoir, "A very curious thing has been the attitude of the press toward the conference. Most of them had apparently been sent to get an amusing story of an international peace gathering of women, base and silly enough to try to meet in wartime, breaking up and quarrel. In other words, the reporters came there expecting to see a bunch of fighting women. Day by day, they went away with faces long in disappointment. In many countries, the meetings were reported to have been either practically unattended or to have closed in a row. Nothing could be further from the truth. The largest hall in The Hague was needed for the meetings, over 2,000 often being present, and difficult as it is to conduct business with so mixed in different languages, different rules of parliamentary procedure, and divergent views, Jane Addams and the other officials carried on orderly and effective sessions, marked by the most active will for unity that I have ever felt in assemblage. So then she goes on and describes the tenor and the mood of the meeting. What stands out most strongly among all my impressions of those thrilling and strange days at The Hague is the sense of wonder at the beautiful spirit of the brave, self-controlled women who dared ridicule and ever, that means they dared to go through the ridicule. The language is a little different. And every sort of difficulty to express a passionate human sympathy, not inconsistent with patriotism, but transcending it. There was not one clash, or even danger of a clash, over national differences. On every hand was the same consciousness of the development of a new spirit which is growing in the midst of the war, as the roots of the wheat grow under the drifts and tempests of winter. It must not be thought, however, that the Congress was stagnantly placid. Everyone's faculty was on the stretch, hour after hour. I think that gives me a taste of what I might be facing when I go to the Netherlands, maybe. So the Congress participants, another important vote they took, which is actually very controversial, was to send delegates to heads of state of both warring and neutral countries to present the resolutions and to call for negotiations to end the war. So after the conference, the delegations traveled to 13 countries, and Jane Addams led a delegation to 8 warring European capitals and to D.C., where she actually met with President Wilson several times. And the purpose was to convince these officials to form a panel to mediate the conflict. And they really hoped that Wilson would lead negotiations. Now, the response from many officials was sympathetic, surprisingly, but they couldn't find anyone to take the lead in negotiations. And Jane Addams wrote about these missions, and in particular about one response, which I found amusing. So she said later on, she wrote, "We went to the office of another high official, a large, grizzled, formidable man. When we had finished our presentation, he said nothing. I remarked, 'It perhaps seems to you very foolish that women should go about in this way, but after all, the world itself is so strange in this war situation that our mission may be no more strange nor foolish than the rest.' He banged his fist on the table. 'Foolish,' he said, 'not at all. These are the first sensible words that have been uttered in this room for 10 months. So despite the resentment for peace, despite the desire, which I find interesting, I have a feeling, that groupthink still takes over, and, these heads of state, not one of them could get beyond their little boundaries and say, hey, we need some peace. So at the Congress, they formed the International Committee of Women for Permanent Peace. And then at their next Congress in 1919, which coincided with the Paris Peace Accords, the name of this group was changed to Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, our current name. Another long name. And Geneva was chosen as the site of the international headquarters, and Jane Addams is the first president. National committees were set up in 13 countries, and these committees are now known as sections. So the U.S. section formed a lobbying office in D.C. in 1917, and not many organizations had lobbyists back then. WILPF now has 30 sections in countries ranging from the UK, France, Germany, New Zealand, Colombia, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Now, 2 of the founders of WILPF, Jane Addams and Emily Belk, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Addams in 1931 and Belk in 1946. So WILPF is now 100 years old, and we're celebrating it at The Hague, and we're returning back to our roots. And when I return, I'll be taking lots of photos, and I will be reporting back on what happened there. And when Detroit branch has its 100th anniversary celebrations, I'll let you know, and I'll definitely be bringing back some news there. So just to summarize, just to conclude that, I feel strongly that the concerns that surrounded WILPF's birth were truly progressive. And these were solidarity with people of all nations, unity, internationalism. And I think that these remain important to WILPF today. So if you want to learn more about WILPF, see me after the meeting or pick up a brochure over there or sign up for our email list. And thank you very much for your time.
Are there any questions? I always learn something, and I didn't know that there were people that wanted war.
Yeah, it's surprising to hear about feminists on war.
I mean, wow, that was a shock. Not in Citizens for Peace. Yusuf.
Thank you for the presentation and how it is that in cultures where kindness is the expectation, as is demonstrated in hospitality in the Middle East, the Arab world, Palestinians. And there was a time, all this really comes from the feminine, and there was a time during the goddess, there was peace, and the goddess was the birther, the giver of life. And we strayed away from that into the male god image with the sword and the warrior. And women need to be honored, and it should be more than having to struggle through organizations for 100 years. The same as with our races and all these things. We're humans.
Any other questions? Actually, working for peace really doesn't seem like a struggle. I'm going to ask the Citizens for Peace members, do you feel like you're struggling? That's why we come here, to realize that we have peace at any time we want it. Unfortunately, the rest of the world needs to catch up with us. Thank you again, Laura.